Hello, this is Mark Galeotti of, amongst other things, the In Moscow Shadows podcast, with, on the morning of Wednesday, the 10th of September, a very quick instant response video about the news that we had Russian drones in Polish airspace last night, several of which were shot down. Now, precisely how many? Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk has said 19. Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine started by saying 8, I think, or 9, and then says 20 or more. But anyway, this is a serious number of drones. And on the whole, they seem to have been either the Geran, which is the Russian-built equivalent of the Iranian Shahed drone, which is one of their main sort of attack drones, shall we say, or else the Gerbera, which is a decoy drone. So what are the basic theories? And by the way, quick spoiler alert, no, I don't think a Russia versus NATO war is about to break out. So rest assured. Anyway, various theories. The first and most benign one is that this was because of Ukrainian electronic warfare sending drones off track. One, maybe two, given that the Russians were indeed attacking Western Ukraine close to the border, well, that might have been possible. However, not this many. And more to the point, the trajectory they took is a trajectory that we have seen in past incursions by Russian drones. Essentially, they were clearly aiming to try and get to Ukrainian targets sort of through a metaphorical backdoor in places where their air defences were not necessarily sort of as fully ready and developed. So no, we can't just simply say this was just an unfortunate accident. Thesis number two at the other extreme is that this was actually an attack on Poland. Well, it's noteworthy that already NATO themselves have said that they do not consider this to be an attack. I mean, if the Russians were actually planning on launching some kind of a serious strike against Poland, particularly the airport that is used for the bringing in of much of the aid that is then shipped by land or by air to Ukraine, then, well, it wouldn't have just been a relative handful of Gerans. They'd be using cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and such like. So we can rule that out. But is it just simply explainable away as that they're just using this as a route to strike at Western Ukraine? Again, I don't think we can just simply dispense with it as that, which still, for what it's worth, I would say is provocative and indeed dangerous, and in fact go so far as to say stupid. But I think it's more than that. The scale of this particular deployment, the fact that it fits in with a lot of rhetoric we've heard lately, for example, Putin himself saying that if there are Western peacekeepers, reassurance force, call it what you will, in Ukraine without Russian approval which wouldn't be forthcoming, then they will be regarded as legitimate military targets. We've had a lot of this really quite sharp rhetoric. So I think that really we have to interpret this as a probe and a warning. A probe precisely to see, okay, well, how does the West react? You know, at the moment, Europe is in a pretty ropey state. We have got government crisis in France, potential government crisis in the UK. We have what looks like a potentially weak German government now. I mean, you know, for all sorts of reasons, they might have thought this is a good time just to test how Europe will act, how indeed the United States will act. So I think that there is an element to which this was regarded as just as a test. But I think more than that, it was, as I say, a warning. It was do you really want to get sucked into this conflict? Do you really want this conflict to continue rolling on with all the unpredictabilities, that entails? After all, remember, from the Russian perspective, this is something that's come out very strongly in the media, in public pronouncements and so forth. They see Europe as the main stumbling block to achieving the kind of peace that Russia wants to impose on Ukraine. Now, they may well be entirely wrong, but in a way that it doesn't matter if they're wrong, if that's what they believe. They think that America will go along with anything, and they rightly think Trump just wants this war over and out the way. They feel that Ukraine, if pushed into a corner, will accept some kind of demeaning and ugly deal with some kind of limitations on its sovereignty, maybe with that remaining portion of Donetsk region handed over, maybe not. But that it's the Europeans who keep trying to introduce what the Russians regard as unnecessary obstacles to peace talks, such as the need for a ceasefire before there can be proper negotiations. It's the Europeans who are, again, this is in the Kremlin's perspective, egging the Ukrainians on to continue fighting and providing them with enough materiel and financial assistance to be able to do so. So I think for all of those reasons, this is also a political warning to Europe, saying this war can only get worse, and with it, the risks that precisely it can spread. We Russians, we are essentially both implacable and unpredictable. Do you really think that you can sort of out chaos us? Now, again, this is something that I've talked about in the past as what I'm sort of playing with the idea of dark power. The idea that if you haven't got soft power, the power of attraction, and if you haven't really got the hard power to be able to force your neighbours and your enemies to bend the knee, you can at least look so dangerous and so unpredictable that people think, frankly, it's better just to pay you off and make you go away than to actually try and challenge you. So I think we're also seeing an element of dark power there. And it's quite noteworthy that this has obviously brought a lot more attention to NATO guarantees. Article 4 has already been invoked, which essentially means consultations in case of a security threat. And some people are saying, well, isn't this an Article 5 issue, the mutual defence guarantee? Well, let's remember that Article 5 is in fact a strikingly vague document, or clause, call it what you will. It doesn't actually say that if someone attacks one NATO member, then everyone else rallies and sends troops and helps. It just simply says that allies will respond appropriately. And quite what that means is left open. So appropriately could mean thoughts and prayers, or a particularly strongly worded message being sent to the Russian Foreign Ministry, as much as it could actually be military assistance. So again, this is why the Russians can operate this way, because they're aware that a relative handful of not even the best necessarily drones does not represent something that is going to drag Europe into war. The question is, though, how does Europe respond? I mean, if this is not going to be treated as war, and no one wants to have a war with Russia, then the key thing is going to be a balance between something that is realistic. There's no point trying to pretend you're going to do things that you're not going to do, even though that unfortunately has often been Europe's first line of response, to make proud, bold claims that then are not carried through. So it's got to be something that is realistic, but also something that is not insignificant, something that the Russians are going to recognise. And look, more sanctions, I don't think Europe really has the capacity meaningfully at this stage to actually do anything more that's going to seriously impact the Russians. I mean, it's interesting that already Hungary is actually beginning to diversify its hydrocarbon supply away from Russia more, but they're not going to be in a position to do so any more rapidly. So sanctions, no. You could take a few more Russian officials and ban them from the Schengen zone, but that's not going to have any great effect. Now, I think we still have to recognise that the primary way of both securing Ukraine, but also of punishing Russia, is via Ukraine. And so I think that on top of whatever military assistance has currently been planned, there has to be some kind of demonstrative add-on, and it clearly should be air defence related. So whether that means actually accelerating the process of transferring Patriot missiles, which are promised and then take months and months and months before the promises actually materialise on the ground. So accelerate the transfer of Patriot batteries, launchers and missiles together. Increase, again, demonstratively come up with another, whatever it is, 50 million euros to buy some more air defence missiles. Something that is over and above what had already been planned. Again, this can't be a sort of area where we actually end up seeing the kind of usual accounting magic that claims increases, but they're not real increases. No, it has to be something that is real, demonstrable, and above all, quick, to show that you mess with Europe, and no, Europe's not about to start sending drones wandering into Moscow region. But on the other hand, there will definitely be a result. And it's got to be a result that is clearly coming from not just the Poles, but Europe as a whole. So this is what I would say is actually the best balance between realism and also pragmatism, actually having some kind of definite effect on Russia. Of course, this is a brand new story. We'll have to see how it plays out. If we get more drones tonight, then I think it's something even more important and even more serious, and frankly demonstrating even greater willingness to take risks on the part of the Kremlin than I'm actually anticipating. But as ever, we wait and see.